Welcome to my English Epics channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. The day everything changed started like any other. Emma was bustling around the kitchen, sipping her coffee, looking as beautiful and put together as ever. She was telling me about her plans for the day, throwing in a few stories about the people at her office, and I listened the same as always, though I felt something different, something that had been lingering at the edges of my awareness for a while now. It was the way she held her phone just out of sight when a notification would pop up, or the way her smile seemed slightly forced when she talked about late nights at work. I hadn't wanted to admit it before, but this feeling was unmistakable. Something was wrong. That evening after Emma left for her supposed networking event, I sat in our quiet house, staring blankly at the TV while a hollow ache gnawed at my chest. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid that after nearly 10 years together, I should know her well enough to trust her, but the lingering doubts refused to go away. Persistent as a dull toothache, we always shared everything. I told myself I was imagining things, maybe letting work stress spill over into my personal life, and yet the words sounded thin and unconvincing, even to me. I tried to ignore it for a few more days. But then, during a lazy Saturday morning, as she was taking a long shower, Emma's phone chimed the sound, breaking through the usual silence of the house like a gunshot. I glanced toward the screen. Her phone was lying on the counter face up with a message notification blaring for all to see. It was from someone named Nick, and it simply read, "Can't wait to see you again." I could feel my stomach drop as I stared at the screen. The message was innocuous enough on the surface, yet it held a promise of intimacy. The kind of message a husband might send to his wife or an unfair partner would send to someone else's wife. I picked up her phone, hesitating for a second, my hand hovering over the screen. This was a step that once taken, I couldn't undo, but the sense of betrayal swelling inside me overpowered any guilt or hesitation. I unlocked the phone and opened her messages there. It was a string of texts between Emma and this Nick stretching back weeks, maybe months. They were filled with inside jokes. I'd never heard references to places she'd never mentioned going and plans for catching up soon. Some were outright flirtatious, and others were too suggestive to be anything other than what I dreaded most. Each word I read felt like a fresh wound, cutting deeper than the last. I dropped the phone back onto the counter, the echo of it hitting the hard surface, bouncing off the walls like a judgment I couldn't ignore. The rest of the weekend passed in a fog. Emma acted as if nothing were wrong, laughing and talking as usual, while my mind reconsumed by every terrible scenario, each one darker than the last. By Monday morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed to know everything. Ignoring the knot of pain tightening in my chest, I spent my lunch hour at work, checking our phone records and skimming through old texts on our shared cloud storage. What I found only confirmed my worst fears. Nick had been a steady presence in her messages and calls for over 3 months, creeping in slowly at first, until he was practically a part of her daily life. I forced myself to go through every detail, the unflinching detective in my own nightmare. I even tracked the dates of her work trips to see how many of those lined up with calls to this Nick. The pieces fell into place like shards of broken glass, sharp and painful, forming a picture. I didn't want to believe she wasn't just seeing him. Occasionally he was woven into the fabric of her life, a presence she'd been nurturing, lying to me every step of the way. As I sat there alone in the break room, I felt the anger starting to boil up, but this wasn't the blind rage I might have expected. It was a slow, icy fury that settled deep in my bones. I realized then that this wasn't going to end with a confrontation or a messy fight in our living room. No. I wanted something else, something that would leave her feeling the weight of her choices, something that would show her just how fragile everything she'd taken for granted really was. The days that followed felt like a twisted, surreal game of pretending. Emma continued her routine, smiling, cooking, laughing like nothing had changed, but everything had changed for me. I felt as though I were living a double life. One as her devoted husband and another as the man who knew her secrets, who held the evidence of her betrayal close to his chest, like a weapon, a hidden blade that could slice through the facade she wore so easily. Every day I played the part of the loving husband biding my time, but each night when Emma would finally drift off to sleep, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in a haze of hurt and planning. I was haunted by thoughts of how deep this betrayal really ran. Had she ever thought about how her actions would affect me? Or was I just a casualty in her pursuit of thrill and excitement? I wasn't just betrayed. I felt replaced, as if our entire life together had been swapped out for something she found more interesting. One evening I found myself sitting in my car long after work had ended, unable to bring myself to walk through the door. The anger simmered, growing with each passing minute, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I were going to confront her, I needed to be ready. A knee-jerk reaction wouldn't be enough. I wanted to make sure she felt the weight of her decisions and didn't walk away with excuses or empty apologies. She would feel what I felt, that much I was certain of. I thought about the years I'd given her, about the support I'd provided when she was struggling at work, the nights I'd stayed up with her when she was sick or overwhelmed, and the sacrifices I'd made for our future. I thought about the dreams we'd shared, the life we were supposed to build together, and how it all meant nothing to her. In the end, I wanted her to see that, to feel the pain she'd inflicted, and to know that I wasn't just a passive bystander to her betrayal. With a strange sense of clarity, I went back into our home that night with my mind already working through the details of my plan. Emma greeted me with her usual smile, and I returned it, almost laughing at the absurdity of it all. She kissed me on the cheek, asking about my day as she stirred a pot on the stove. I could barely keep a straight face as I told her it was fine. This was a woman who thought she had me fooled, who thought she was getting away with it all. I started small, changing little things. She noticed I would leave house earlier, my lunches alone, and avoid any conversation that felt too close, too intimate. She'd give me curious looks every now and then, asking if everything was okay, and I would brush her off, telling her I was just busy with work if she found my distance strange. She never pressed further. She probably thought I was oblivious, that her secrets were still hidden safely away. Then I started subtly unraveling parts of her life. One night when she went to bed early, I went into her home office and sifted through her files, collecting copies of every financial document, every bank statement, every text and email thread I could find. I transferred everything to my own private email, each message, each piece of evidence cataloged and saved, waiting for the right moment. I wasn't just preparing for a confrontation. I was setting the stage for her undoing on a hunch. I checked our joint accounts. She'd made several recent withdrawals, small amounts here and there, that added up to more than I'd expected. It didn't take much to figure out that she was siphoning off funds to support her little escapades with Nick. She hadn't even bothered to hide the money trail, as though she were so sure. I'd never noticed the audacity of it, both stunned and infuriated me, the extent of her carelessness pushing me closer to the edge. The final piece came to me by accident. One night when she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the countertop again. This time it wasn't a message from Nick, it was from her best friend Katie. The message read, "Astros, can't believe you're finally going to tell him you've been talking about this forever." I froze, my pulse quickening. As I read the message, she was planning to tell me she was going to break it off. Maybe leave me for Nick. Part of me felt a brief surge of hope. Maybe she had decided to be honest, to admit everything and try to make things right. But deep down I knew better. She wasn't going to confess out of guilt. She was doing it because her plan with Nick had reached a point where it required her to leave me behind. This wasn't remorse, it was convenience. She wanted a way out, a clean break, so she could start a new life without the baggage of our marriage. And that was the last straw. That weekend I went to visit my brother, who lived out of state. It was the perfect cover, giving me a plausible excuse to be away from the house for a few days while I finalized my preparations. My brother had always been supportive, though he knew nothing about what I was dealing with. I needed that distance, that time to calm myself and ensure I could pull off what I had planned. Back at home, Emma acted as though nothing was wrong. She even kissed me goodbye with a smile, sending me off with promises to miss me while I was away. I could only manage a strained smile in return, feeling the bitter taste of betrayal laced through her every word. She thought she was playing me. She thought she was untouchable, but she was wrong. By the time I returned, I would have everything in place, and she'd finally understand what it felt like to lose something irreplaceable. When I returned from my trip, I felt calm, almost serene. The weeks leading up to it had been filled with so much anger and anxiety that I had nearly lost myself in it. But now, standing in the driveway of the house I once called home, I was strangely at peace. I walked inside my steps, measured, each one echoing with purpose. Emma was in the kitchen, her back to me, humming softly as she put away groceries. The sight felt almost surreal, a snapshot of normalcy that I would have found comforting only a few months ago. Now it felt hollow, an empty performance for an audience who had long since left. Emma turned and saw me, her eyes lighting up with a smile as she walked over to hug me. I returned the hug, though it felt like going through the motions. Part one had to play for just a little while longer. She asked about my trip, listening with the casual attentiveness of someone who knew it didn't matter. After all, she had her own plans, her own story. She was about to tell me, but I had one of my own. That night I waited for the right moment. We sat down to dinner, sharing an easy silence that had once meant comfort but now felt like the lull before a storm. I watched her studying the lines of her face, the small mannerisms I used to adore, like the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear as she leaned in to speak. How had I not seen the truth in those little moments? How had I missed the signs that this woman who I thought I knew so well had already left me in her heart? She must have sensed my intensity, though, because at one point she looked up, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft as though she were afraid of the answer. "Everything's fine," I replied, keeping my voice steady, calm, just thinking about us, about all the time we've spent together. Her lips curved into a small smile, her eyes softening, but I could see the gears turning behind that smile. She was probably weighing her options, thinking about how to steer the conversation toward her plans, how to soften the blow of whatever speech she had prepared. I could almost predict her words, the careful choice of phrases like needing space or finding herself. I knew she'd try to justify it as if her needs somehow made her betrayal noble, a journey rather than a mistake. After dinner, I suggested we have a drink, something we hadn't done in a long time. Emma looked surprised, maybe even a little nervous, but she agreed, probably assuming it would make her confession easier to deliver. We sat in the living room, sipping wine, the silence between us stretching thin. I could feel her fidgeting, glancing at me every so often, as if gauging my mood, but I was patient. I wanted her to make the first move. Eventually she took a deep breath, setting her glass down on the table. Her eyes were downcast, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she began. "Listen, there's something I need to talk to you about," she said, her voice soft, almost trembling. "This isn't easy for me, and I want you to know that I never meant to hurt you." She paused, looking up to gauge my reaction, but I just nodded silently, urging her to continue. I didn't need her to stop. I needed her to say every word she had prepared, to spill out all her excuses and justifications, so I could see once and for all how far she was willing to go to rewrite our history. "I know I've been distant," she continued, her voice shaky, "and I know you've probably noticed. It's just that things haven't felt right for a while. I felt lost, like I needed something more, and it's been confusing." She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't want to hide anything from you, but you did." I interrupted, my tone colder than I intended. Her head shot up, her eyes wide, surprise flashing across her face. She hadn't expected me to say anything. She'd expected me to listen, to accept her words like a passive participant in her narrative. "Yes," she admitted softly, her voice breaking, "but it wasn't because I don't love you. I do love you in my own way. I needed something else, something you couldn't give me." Her voice trailed off, her gaze falling again as she fidgeted with her hands. I let her words hang in the air, heavy and damning. I could feel my heart hardening with every syllable, a wall of steel, replacing whatever love I'd once felt for her. She was asking me to understand, to sympathize with her, as if this were a small misstep, a necessary detour on her personal journey. But I wasn't the man she thought I was anymore. I wasn't going to just sit there and take it. "You needed something else." I echoed, my voice flat, and that something was someone else. It was Nick. Her eyes widened, her face palling as she realized the depth of what I knew. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out for a moment. I almost felt sorry for her, watching her struggle to find an explanation that didn't exist. "I know everything. Emma," I continued, my tone sharp, unyielding. "I know about the messages, the late nights, the lies. I know about all of it." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears, but I wasn't moved. She'd had her chance, to be honest, to respect the life we'd built. Now she would face the consequences all this time. "You thought I didn't know." I went on, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. "You thought you could keep lying, that I'd just keep playing along, but I'm done playing, Emma." Her voice broke as she stammered. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just lost." "You weren't lost, Emma," I replied coldly. "You were selfish, and you didn't care who got hurt, as long as you got what you wanted." She sat there silent and broken, the weight of her choices settling over her like a shroud. I knew she was realizing, maybe for the first time, that she wasn't the one in control anymore. "Hack your things," I said, my voice hard. "I want you out." By morning, the shock on her face would have been satisfying if I hadn't already been number to it. She started to speak, to plead, but I held up a hand, stopping her. I've already made the arrangements. The house is mine, the accounts are closed to you, and by this time tomorrow you'll be gone. Go to him if he'll have you, but you don't get to stay here, not after this." For a moment she sat there, stunned, the realization dawning on her. This wasn't a game anymore. She wasn't going to talk her way out of this. She'd lost everything. Finally she nodded, defeated, and stood walking slowly toward the stairs. She didn't look back and I didn't call after her. I sat there listening as she packed her things. The finality of it sinking in this chapter of my life was closing, and there was no going back. When the door finally shut behind her, I felt the weight lift, a strange, exhilarating freedom settling in its place. I wasn't the man she thought she could control anymore. I was free, and as I sat in the silence of that empty house, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. The weeks that followed were like waking up from a long, dark dream. The house was emptier, yes, but it felt cleaner, quieter, as if Emma's betrayal had left with her. I settled into a new rhythm, reclaiming spaces that once felt like they belonged to us, and making them my own. Friends checked in, worried that I'd fall apart, but I surprised them and myself by embracing the solitude, the freedom to start again. Yet deep down, there was a flicker of resentment that refused to fade, a question that lingered, ask why. Why had she done it, and was there more to it than what I knew? Asterisk. About a month later, I received a message from an unknown number, a text that read, asterisks, "Hey, it's Nick. I think we need to talk," asterisk, for a moment. I felt my pulse quicken, the familiar anger boiling up. I wanted to ignore him, to pretend he didn't exist, but something held me back. Against my better judgment, I texted back, asterisk, "What do you want?" Asterisk, "Within minutes," he replied. Asterisk, "Can we meet? There are things you don't know about Emma, things I didn't know either." Curiosity overtook my anger, and I agreed to meet him at a small coffee shop on the edge of town. I arrived first, feeling out of place, unsure of what to expect. When Nick walked in, he looked nothing like the smug, arrogant figure I'd imagined. He looked worn, tense, as if he hadn't slept in days. He spotted me, nodded, and sat down across from me without a word. For a few moments we sat in silence, both men haunted by the same woman, but in very different ways. He looked at me, eyes tired, and finally broke the silence. "Look," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know about you, not really Emma. She never told me she was married until months into whatever this was." I felt a strange sense of satisfaction at his discomfort, but I kept my expression neutral, waiting for him to continue. "She told me she was leaving someone, that you were cold or distant, that you'd grown apart." He shook his head as if realizing the weight of those lies. But as time went on, things didn't add up. I'd catch her in lies, inconsistencies, and one day I confronted her about it, and I asked, feeling a strange, twisted need to hear everything, every painful detail. He took a deep breath, his eyes darting around as if trying to find the words. She admitted she was married, that she wasn't ready to leave, but there was more. She started saying things that didn't make sense, things about money, about schemes. I leaned in, intrigued, despite myself. "Schemes?" "Yeah," he replied, lowering his voice. "She said she wanted us to keep seeing each other, but under certain terms. She wanted me to be her alibi." He looked at me, his expression dark. "She told me she'd been siphoning money from your joint accounts. Small amounts, things you wouldn't notice, and that eventually she'd have enough to leave for good without a trace." I clenched my fists under the table. The betrayal, fresh and raw again. I'd known about the withdrawals, but hadn't imagined the extent of her planning, her willingness to use me as a pawn in her escape plan. But Nick wasn't done. Then things got stranger. He continued, his voice cracking. "One night she told me that she had another account, one that I didn't know about. She said she'd used it to hire someone. My heart pounded. Hire someone for what? To follow you." He said, his voice hollow. "She wanted someone to follow. You track your movements," she said. "It was in case you caught on that she wanted to be ahead of you. If you tried to trap her," he let out a humorless laugh. "She made it sound like you were the problem, like you were controlling her, manipulating her for a moment." I felt dizzy, struggling to comprehend the depth of her deceit. It wasn't just an affair, wasn't just money. She'd planned this, orchestrated it like a chess game. Each move calculated to keep herself one step ahead. And now as I sat there, the realization hit me. Emma hadn't left me just for Nick. She'd left me for herself. But Owen. "You believed all this?" I asked, incredulous. He looked down, his face shadowed with regret. "I did for a while, but then she started getting erratic. She'd change plans, go days without contacting me, and when she did, she'd have wild stories about someone following her. It was like she'd forgotten who was stalking. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly, the absurdity of it all crashing over me. Emma had become trapped in her own web, lost in the lies she'd spun, until even she didn't know what was real. Nick leaned in his expression. Deadly serious look. I didn't come here just to tell you this. I think she might be dangerous to both of us. I think she's coming undone, and she's not the kind of person to let things go. A chill ran down my spine, a cold realization settling in. I thought I was free, that I'd walked away from her twisted games. But now I wondered if I was only part of her next plan. Suddenly the silence I'd cherished felt ominous, as if she were lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. We exchanged numbers, an uneasy alliance forming between us, two men bound by the same darkness as I left the coffee. I glanced over my shoulder half, expecting to see her eyes gleaming with that familiar cold calculation. The next day, I found a note in my mailbox written in her handwriting, asterisk, "You'll regret what you've done. Don't think this is over, Aster." I read the note again, feeling the threat curl around me, an invisible shackle reminding me that even now Emma had control. She was gone from my life, but her presence lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder that she hadn't really left. In the end, I had escaped the marriage, but not Emma. I had taken back my life, but she had claimed a part of me, leaving a scar that I could never erase. And as I looked around, my every sense heightened. I realized that her game was far from over. Emma had lost her husband and her lover, but the real victory was hers. She had left me looking over my shoulder, waiting for her next move, trapped in a cycle she designed for me, one I couldn't walk away from. Not really. Her revenge was a masterpiece, one that ensured I'd never truly be free.